There is a game that scares me like no other. One that cut such deep metaphorical scars into my prepubescent psyche that reservations about playing it even permeate my adulthood. Which of the classic horror series might it be? Well, this was no Alone in the Dark, no Clock Tower, no Resident Evil, no Silent Hill. No, the game I'm talking about is Ecco the Dolphin. I mean, you probably guessed that already given the fact you've seen the video's title and thumbnail, but allow me some dramatic tension. But yeah, Ecco. Maybe you've played it and know where I'm coming from. Maybe you vaguely remember it from the early 90s but didn't get too far into it. Maybe you've never heard of it and are confused as to how the footage you're watching just now could ever be deemed scary. How did this Sega Mega Drive, or Genesis, cult classic about a flippy old dolphin come to have such a negative effect on me? Was there just something in the water? Before I tell you why, I'll preface it by saying this video was based on an article I wrote for Vice several years ago, partly inspired by Ecco's creator Ed Annunziata following me on Twitter. I wrote the piece while waiting for a 140 character apology from the big man to restore the fractured pieces of my childhood, but he wasn't forthcoming. Upon its publication though, I was amazed at how many messages and emails I received from people who had been similarly affected by the game. Even friends of mine described how it had shaken them up, the ones who had managed to get past the notoriously difficult introductory levels anyway. It turned out I wasn't alone and I had unwittingly started some kind of online Ecco support group, but that's a flag I'll carry with pride. So let me tell you my story. As a child, video games were my main pastime. I played out in the streets often enough, but there was nothing my younger nerd enjoyed more in the afternoon than a journey into a vivid virtual world. However, that often involved being at the mercy of uninitiated older family members who possessed that typical unfounded take that video games were inherently a waste of time. To them I might as well have been in my room injecting heroin. Sonic didn't pester me like that. The only way he would ever judge me was tapping his foot impatiently while I stopped playing momentarily to tie my arm. All Mario ever had to say was as we leapt into another adventure. They understood me. My mother then, perhaps reluctantly, bought me a game. A recommendation from her friend's much older son, who, it later transpired, was a long-haired dope-smoking recluse and death metal aficionado. And while I have nothing against such types, they're not necessarily ideal role models for childhood recreation. Considering my interest in sea life and a vague ambition of becoming a marine biologist, she took his advice and purchased a copy of Ecco the Dolphin. It was to be one of the most memorable games I would play in my life. I excitedly popped in the cartridge and within moments was merrily darting around the first level home bay, talking to my dolphin chums via sonar and leaping out of the water like I didn't have a care in the world. One huge jump, however, would prove to be disastrous. Breaching a certain height triggered a violent hurricane that instantly sucked all the wildlife out of the sea and into the sky with a frightening cacophony. I stared in disbelief as I was suddenly alone in the water and a strange mournful tune filtered in. If anything, this eldritch abomination of a game was starting as it meant to go on. The first few levels see you face a huge octopus whose arms you need to slowly pass or face a sting, as well as the odd easily avoided shark. Those I can just about live with, the rest I still struggle to. The first major jump for me comes at a quarter of the way through in the open ocean level. It's the urgency with which it starts by dropping Ecco from the sky as screeching sodden music mercilessly floods out, as though spurring you on to take action when you've got no real sense of objective in an unknown world. It's the most linear course, with no real walls or floor, just more sharks than a dodgy pool house, all of whom are intent on lining their stomachs with our cetacean pal. Mechanically, you can just head to the bottom and dash your way to the end, but upon your first experience, it's just absolute panic stations. Surviving that prime example of the fight or flight response eventually leads you to the Big Blue, a monolithic whale and perhaps the biggest piece of sprite artwork to grace a 90s console. He was, thank Christ, a friendly creature, but the way that he appeared out of the vast nothingness of the Arctic waters with a low echoing drone was enough to guarantee that the controller hadn't even hit the floor by the time I was out of the room. After that came the asteroid. The DNA double helix of orbs was a being of higher consciousness that would guide Ecco in his quest. It wasn't particularly fearsome, although there was something troubling about suddenly being trapped in this small cave with this faceless, otherworldly entity unlike any you'd seen up until then, and it did set the precedent for the game's subsequent weirdness. It sends us to the ruins of Atlantis, where things take a notable leap from the until then realistic settings. In an ancient chamber, Ecco learns of aliens that feed upon the planet every 500 years and that the humans had built a time machine to flee into another era. In order to help the asteroid, the dolphin uses said time machine to travel 55 million years into the past. Terrific. Dinosaurs ahoy. As an aside, and as with many forms of media that deal with time travel, Ecco creates some time paradoxes at this point in the story. The asteroid claims to remember Ecco in their first meeting, referring to how in the prehistoric arc you retrieve its missing orb from its ancient self to return to its present form. But how would the asteroid remember Ecco if the only reason it met him in the past was because it sent him back through time to begin with? There are also hidden messages from the prehistoric land mammals who say they'll try to breathe in the water after seeing Ecco do it, suggesting the dolphin's presence in the past was the catalyst for the very evolution of dolphins, which in real life were a land mammal that re-entered the water and evolved to become aquatic. But how would dolphins have evolved for Ecco to exist in the first place if the ancient animals hadn't been inspired to enter the water until seeing him do it when he came from the future? See also Terminator, Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, Ocarina of Time, Back to the Future, Arrival, The Butterfly Effect, Looper, Triangle, Primer, 12 Monkeys. Anyway, here's a little scenario that would often happen in the prehistoric arc. Having been dropped into the water by a pteranodon that helps you navigate the Carboniferous landscape, you decide to swim slowly as the path guides you downwards into dark, foreboding caverns. Suddenly, a trilobite that can inexplicably swim faster than a dolphin gives chase from nowhere and attacks relentlessly, Ecco doing that piercing screech like he's being electrocuted every time. You're soon forced to reconsider your wary approach to exploration and dash off, invariably swimming right into the titanium jaws of a Dunkleosteus, a monstrous, thankfully now extinct armoured fish, one that I actually have tattooed on my arm. These levels are probably the most troubling for me. There are weirder sci-fi elements to come, but just when you thought you were becoming accustomed to Ecco's locales and enemies, it throws this curveball at you and you've no idea what to expect in these new, darker waters. Or old darker waters, I guess. Returning through time with the orb, Ecco makes the asteroid and is granted new powers. He uses the time machine again to go back to the first level of our Lovecraftian childhood adventure and follows his pod into the intergalactic tube that originally claimed half of the ocean, flying across the universe into some sort of industrial space station. At this point, everything is off the charts mental. The penultimate level is a lurching biomechanical hell in which one wrong turn will compress Ecco into an economy brand of canned tuna in a flash of scarlet red, forcing you to start from the beginning. Couple that with the fact there are many Cthulhus coming at you from all angles, and it's perhaps one of the most frustrating levels in gaming history, a prime instance of the game's unforgiving difficulty, a deliberate decision on the creator's part to increase the likelihood of purchases over weekend rentals. The final boss, the Vortex Queen, is potent nightmare fuel. She's a gargantuan, disembodied H.R. Giger alien-like head against a backdrop of complete blackness. Being sucked into her gaping razor-line maw will send you back to the previous stage, ensuring that if the fear didn't get to you, the anger would. Defeating her sees her spit out all the fishies and Ecco returns home with his family, a hero. It's difficult to pinpoint exactly what makes Ecco such an unsettling experience, but a large part of it is what can be described as thalassophobia, the fear of large open bodies of water, something the game routinely taps into. Sometimes just seeing the background grow darker and having no visible walls, floor or ceiling on screen is enough to set me on edge, because the problem is as much encounters with predatory creatures happening as it is the instilled sense that they could happen at any moment, especially when you're open to attack from all angles. The music, while nothing short of sublime, certainly doesn't help shake this feeling of uncertainty. The throbbing bass lines that beat like a heart as you search frantically for air pockets. The whimpers over the melancholic prehistoric themes. The idiosyncratic ambience and playful melodies that undermine your struggle. These Pink Floydian soundscapes create a perpetual sense of mystery and, subsequently, a merciless sonic backdrop against which an enemy could spring at you from thin H2O. Strangely, for levels so full of life, there's a sense of loneliness. The underwater world is unknown to us to begin with, but here it's further turned into a barren dystopia with in-game clues suggesting humans no longer inhabit the planet and the initial high degree of realism conjuring up a palpable feeling of abandonment. As a horror aficionado, I've shot and slashed my fair share of monsters. My dad even fell asleep on the couch one night when I was a kid and I ended up watching The Exorcist by myself with no repercussions, or nothing that years of therapy didn't fix. Why does Ecco scare me more than a lot of straight up horror? I think it's ultimately down to context. You go into a survival shoot 'em up knowing that you'll be spending the majority of your time feeling jolts in your viscera as you fight for your life against whatever unholiness may come. Abandoned mansions, claps of thunder and bumps in the night are created with the intention of filling underwear. You go into a relatively realistic title about a dolphin, however, with the expectation of flipping around happily, interacting with the other sea creatures and perhaps the odd run-in with a shark at most. The surrealistic scares of Ecco could partly be explained by where Annunziata seemingly got the idea for the game, the work of one John C. Lilly. Put bluntly, Lilly was something of a mad scientist who became infamous in the 1960s for his drug-fueled studies into the human mind, as well as studies into communication between humans and dolphins. His team went as far as to flood a house on St Thomas in the Virgin Islands in order for a volunteer named Margaret Lovett to live with a young dolphin named Peter, through which they could document their relationship and even teach him to mimic human speech.
Fish in bucket.
Things got just a wee bit weird though, as Margaret ended up in a sort of pseudo-sexual relationship with Peter in order to satisfy his needs to improve his behaviour during studies. While she saw it as an innocent, affectionate relationship, this racy story of a woman banging a dolphin began to overshadow the experiment, as did Lily's growing disinterest and inhumane treatment of the creatures. He'd even inject the other two dolphins in the house with LSD to see if it had any effect on them, and was disappointed when it didn't. After government funding was pulled, the dolphins were moved to another lab where they were kept in deplorable conditions. At this point, Peter reportedly committed suicide by holding his breath underwater, thought to be heartbroken at being ripped away from Margaret. She still reflects fondly on her time with the dolphin to this day, and has been the subject of various documentaries and articles. Lilly continued tripping balls on acid and ketamine during the 60s, ostensibly in the name of scientific research, which ultimately led him to believe that aliens had stolen his penis, and that he was in contact with a body of extraterrestrial deities known as the Earth Coincidence Control Office, or for short, ECHO. Annunziata has since rowed back on the idea that Lilly was his inspiration, but a real-world story of dolphin intelligence, interspecies communication, and aliens-branded ECHO is all a little too spooky to be entirely coincidental. Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction. Looking at ECHO retrospectively only serves to add to the wonder of what now-defunct developers Novotrade achieved. Fitting so much atmosphere and so many disparate elements into a cartridge 30 years ago is, in a way, a much more impressive feat than giving a Hollywood shine and committee-designed scares to the horror games of today. The anachronistic, subtle discomfort plays on the mind more and has undoubtedly led to a demographic of 90s kids who never learned to swim. The game's success led to a few sequel spin-offs and ports. It was demade for the Master System and Game Gear, but these do literally capture the essence of the original. 1994's The Tides of Time, a direct continuation of the first entry, didn't so much take the sci-fi baton as bludgeon its predecessor to death with it and run off with its wallet. Among other things, it features telekinetic flying dolphins from the future and the ability to turn into other animals, including a seagull. There's actually one level where you have to fly around the seaside stealing people's chips. Nah, I'm only joking. For me though, out of the first two games, it's the relative realism and plaintive atmosphere of the first one that keeps the crown on its head. There were also kids versions known as Echo Jr. on both the Mega Drive and the educational Sega Pico console. These were more about puzzles, bopping balls around with your snout and frolicking with sea lions than psychological terror though. There was one on the Dreamcast too, but despite being one of the few weirdos who owned that console, I've never played it. Is it scary as well? Let me know in the comments. Annunziata has actually expressed interest in making a new Echo game. A decade ago he met with Sega to discuss it, but nothing has since come to fruition. He also launched a Kickstarter for a spiritual successor called The Big Blue in 2013, but it didn't even meet 10% of its target. More recently, it was announced that Ed's team were working on Dolphin Quest for the Intellivision Amico, but given that console's apparent development hell, who knows when or where we'll ultimately see a new aquatic outing from Mr. A. I feel that I might be coming down with an acute case of Stockholm Syndrome, as even after all of this somewhat genuine mental scarring, I can't begrudge Echo the title of something of a masterpiece. It's not even necessarily good in terms of gameplay, it's consistently frustrating, unfairly difficult, at times confusing, and too often relies on trial, error and luck. Yet I can't help but be captivated by it. Atmosphere is woven into every pixel of its being and the immersion rarely lets up. I'm evidently not alone in my praise for it, as its legacy can be felt through several other modern games based around underwater exploration. It lives on in Subnautica, Song of the Deep, Absu, Bronte, Aquaria and my nightmares. Even though a fair portion of the memories it holds are unpleasant to the extent that I still do a semi-conscious psych up every time I see the glistening Sega logo upon starting, the fact that I still hold it in such high regard is pretty special. Or maybe Mum knew all along, and it was a ploy to scare me into getting some fresh air. If you've been affected by any of the issues raised in this video, join my Echo support group by liking and subscribing. Trust me, it helps.